We gather not in thanksgiving, but in mourning for what was lost.
Have you ever wondered what shadows lie beneath a story told too sweetly? Before we step deeper into this dim corridor of forgotten truths, tell me, from what corner of the world are you listening? The fire is low, the night is long, and the spirits who guard old stories lean closer when names and places are spoken aloud. And if you are new to these haunted narrations, wandering in from distant lands or stumbling upon this tale by chance, subscribe so that each new story finds you like a whisper at midnight, guiding you back to the circle of those who dare to listen. Now come closer, for the truth beneath Thanksgiving waits like an unquiet ghost, and we must not keep it waiting. The tale begins long before the feast, long before the gentle lies and painted smiles, long before the Mayflower crested the dark Atlantic waves, before the first pilgrim foot sank into New England soil. A quiet death had already passed through the land. It did not roar, it did not march. It moved unseen, invisible as the wind that curls through a hollow tree in winter, and it devoured everything it touched. The Wampanoag and countless other indigenous peoples had lived upon these coasts for centuries, carving their lives into the rhythms of the forest, the tides, the winds that spoke secrets only they could hear. Their villages were once full of laughter, full of the pulse of daily life, the crackle of hearth fires, the steady hum of children's voices, the song of birds that had always known their coming and going. But a plague had arrived first, born by European traders who themselves were messengers of sickness, ignorance, and death. Some call it smallpox. Some say it was something older than the ships that carried it, older than the humans who unwittingly spread it. It is enough to know that it did not discriminate, that it swept across the coast like a shadow with teeth, killing up to 90% of the people who called this land home. The villages emptied, the fires grew cold, the cornfields, once nurtured with care, grew wild and tangled in the absence of hands that had tended them. Those who survived did so like ghosts walking among bones, their strength hollowed, their numbers decimated, their spirits burdened, and yet they remained. The Wampanoag, led by the wisdom of their sachems, clung to the land that had always fed them, to the rivers that had always reflected the moon as a mirror, to the forests that had sheltered them through centuries of storms and hunting. They were surrounded by other tribes, some untouched by the plague, some barely grazed by its bite, and some enemies who now saw weakness where once there was balance. Every day was a negotiation with survival, every decision heavy with consequence. It was a world in which every shadow might hide a threat, where hunger was a companion as constant as the sun rising over the frozen coast, where death was a visitor whose knock could come at any hour. Into this world stepped the pilgrims, pale and trembling, weak from the ocean's cruelty, ignorant of the layers of grief and danger that preceded their arrival. They were starving, they were cold, and they were desperate. Their eyes fell upon the land and saw opportunity without seeing the centuries of life that had molded it. They saw empty fields and interpreted them as empty blessings. They saw abandoned homes and called them providence. The Wampanoag, though weakened, recognized the newcomers not merely as strange and fragile, but as a presence that might be turned to their advantage, as fragile things often can be. Strategic minds weighed the options. Could this people, so alien and so desperate, become allies? Could they be used to safeguard what remained, to keep rivals at bay, to protect the fragile thread of survival stretched across the land? There was no friendship in this, no joy, no celebration, only calculation. The survivors moved among the ashes of their own kind and among the still smoking earth of the villages, reading the signs that others overlooked. They understood the calculus of life, help or risk extinction, align or vanish. And so they reached a decision. They would aid the pilgrims, teaching them to plant, to hunt, to fish, to survive, because necessity demanded it, and because the survival of their own people might hang on it. But even in this careful alliance, the wounds of disease left their mark. The Wampanoag had lost so many that their community could barely sustain itself. Every helping hand given to the strangers was a further strain, every teaching a silent acknowledgement of the peril in which they all existed. The plague had reshaped the human landscape, hollowing it, leaving fractures that would never fully heal. The pilgrims did not understand this, for they interpreted help as friendship, aid as providence, survival as mercy. They did not see the blood on the hands that guided them, nor did they hear the quiet mourning beneath the rhythmic teaching of the seasons and the soil. They only saw the immediate solution to their hunger and weakness, never comprehending the depth of the wound that stretched across the land, across generations. This is why the story of the first Thanksgiving, as it is told in polite classrooms and on cheerful television screens, is so misleading. Beneath every act of assistance, beneath every seed planted and every fish shared, there existed the shadow of desperation, the weight of a population already halved by death. Beneath the smiles and cooperation lay calculation, strategy, and survival. There was no unity. There was no harmony. There was necessity, cold, unyielding, aware of the fragility of human life when disease has already thinned the ranks. And yet, the pilgrims were not merely innocent beneficiaries of circumstance. Their arrival carried the latent dangers of colonization, not just hunger, but expansion, not just survival, but domination. For as they took lessons in planting and hunting from the Wampanoag, they also set in motion the slow, inexorable encroachment that would consume the land and reshape the lives of its people. Treaties were broken with a careless regularity, lands were seized, diseases continued to spread, and resources that had once sustained a thriving culture were extracted or claimed by force. What began as a cautious cooperation, born of necessity and survival, began to twist into hostility and displacement. The people who had offered guidance and sustenance now faced strangers who were becoming masters of the soil they had once walked as equals. The landscape itself bore witness to this transformation. Forests were cleared, rivers rerouted, and the silent witnesses, the trees, the stones, the winds, observed the slow unmaking of a world that had survived plague only to face human conquest. The survivors of disease, who had already endured the most merciless hand of mortality, now found themselves under siege from another kind of death. The theft of home, the erasure of sovereignty, the slow suffocation of culture. The land that had fed them, that had healed them, that had witnessed their survival against disease, was now under threat in ways the invisible plague could never have accomplished. Human greed, ambition, and disregard for life carried a more enduring, more precise destruction than any illness. And yet, for all this, the Wampanoag persevered. They moved carefully, as always, weighing every step, measuring every interaction. Their survival demanded diplomacy and vigilance. Each seed taught to the newcomers was a potential lifeline. Each fish shared a calculated risk. They navigated the presence of the pilgrims as one navigates a forest full of hidden predators, aware, alert, cautious, always calculating the cost of kindness and the cost of survival. Their history, already marked by grief, became a landscape of shadowed negotiation, of careful patience, of the resilience of people who had survived annihilation once and knew the patterns of death well enough to recognize it in others. So let us remember this. Before the feast, before the celebrations, before the myth, there was death. Not the ceremonial, distant death of legend or the sanitized storybooks, but a real, palpable, devastating death. The plague hollowed a people. It left villages empty, families fragmented, and survival fragile. Into this hollowed world stepped strangers who would eventually bring not only hunger, but expansion. Not only new tools, but theft. Not only survival, but conquest. And the Wampanoag, though wise, though patient, though resilient, were forced to navigate this reality, teaching, aiding, guiding, while watching the first seeds of displacement and violence take root beneath the soil they had tended for generations. The wound that the plague left was the prelude to the wound that colonization would carve. One struck with the invisibility of illness, the other with the precision of ambition. Both reshaped the land and its people in ways that echo through centuries, haunting the fields where children now play, where the rivers still flow, where forests reclaim what humans thought they could own. The Wampanoag survived, but the world they entered after the Pilgrims' arrival was already unrecognizable, a landscape of shadow and possibility, of aid and betrayal, of calculation and survival. And the shadow of that first wound, the plague, the emptiness, the death, remains lingering beneath the modern myth, whispering in the trees, flowing in the rivers, waiting for us to remember that history is not a story of cheerful feasts, but of survival against relentless and unyielding forces. Listen closely now, for we must descend deeper into the marrow of this tale, into the wounds beneath the wounds, the shadows beneath the shadows. The first chapter ended with the trembling twilight that fell upon the New England shores, but the night that followed was far darker than any pilgrim prayer ever admitted. And so, let me draw you back into that dim corridor of history, where the air smells of salt, sorrow, and the unburied dead. For long before the pilgrims carved their uncertain footprints upon the sand, the land had already begun to mourn. It began with a sickness carried in the breath of strangers, men who were not yet settlers, not yet conquerors, but wanderers drifting along the coast in earlier years. They brought no armies then, only metal trinkets, rough hands, and invisible death folded into their very skin. The plague came silently, as all true phantoms do. No thunder announced it, no omen warned of its appetite. It crept from village to village like a winter that refused to thaw, shrouding the coast in a hush so deep that even the birds seemed to forget their songs. Some say it was a fever that scorched the body. Others recall chills that gripped the bones like a spirit refusing to release its host. But the truth, whispered through generations, is that the sickness moved with an intelligence, choosing, punishing, erasing. It killed not by the dozen, nor the 100, but by the nation. Entire peoples vanished, their homes left abandoned to the wind, their memories stolen by a ghost with no face. Up to 9 in every 10 lives on that coastline were extinguished. Imagine that, dear listener, not as a statistic whispered in a classroom, but as a field of voices silenced mid-breath. Picture the fires that burned in villages where no hands remained to tend them, trees bending over empty pathways like mourners leaning over closed coffins. The Wampanoag, once powerful, now stood surrounded by the haunting absence of their own kin. Their enemies, who had suffered less, circled like wolves sensing weakness, Hunger stalked them. Loneliness shadowed them. Grief lived in the corners of every surviving home. And into this desolation, into this landscape already bruised by death, arrived the Pilgrims, starving, shivering, lost. It is important to understand this moment, not through the bland sweetness of children's books, but through the raw truth of human desperation. The Pilgrims were not saviors, nor heroes, nor the smiling figures painted on holiday posters. They were intruders on the brink of extinction. Their lips cracked from thirst, their limbs swollen from malnutrition, their prayers brittle with despair. Their first winter dug graves faster than it built homes. Nearly half of them died, and those who lived carried the scent of the grave upon their skin. The Wampanoag watched them, watched their fumbling attempts to survive, watched death cling to them like frost, and in that fragile moment weighed their choices. They could destroy the newcomers easily. The Pilgrims were few, and the forest was vast. But war demanded strength, and strength had been stolen from them by plague and encroaching threats. So the Wampanoag made a decision rooted not in naivete, but in strategic desperation, an alliance. They would help these strangers, teach them the land, the soil, the waters, lend them breath so that the Wampanoag themselves might continue breathing. What a haunting irony that is. An irony history often buries beneath parades and feasts. The Wampanoag, weakened and mourning, extended a hand to those who would one day break it. At first, the cooperation was fragile, trembling, like two wounded animals approaching one another in the dark. Seeds were shared, boundaries discussed, treaties spoken aloud beneath the sky that had witnessed far older agreements between people and land. But treaties, like bones, are easy to fracture when greed enters the marrow. And greed did come, quietly at first, then boldly, then violently. The Pilgrims' children grew. Their settlements expanded like a creeping shadow, swallowing trees, fields, watersheds. Their hunger, once for survival, transformed into a hunger for territory. They marked land as though they had carried it in their pockets across the Atlantic. They claimed borders as though mere ink could erase centuries of indigenous belonging. Treaties that had been spoken with solemnity were dismissed with a shake of the head. Lands promised to the Wampanoag were sliced into squares and sold. Forests sacred for generations were cut down to build towns that carried foreign names. Rivers that once carried stories were diverted to feed colonial farms. Disease came again and again and again, not as a single ghost this time, but as a legion of invisible spirits riding upon rifles, blankets, and breath. And the colonists grew bold, bolder than any guest has the right to be. They brought more settlers, more weapons, more doctrine that declared themselves chosen, rightful, destined. A chilling thing happens when belief is sharpened into a blade. A people who believe they are chosen do not see those they displace. They see shadows, obstacles, inconveniences. They see a land not shared, but promised. What began as cautious cooperation curdled into hostility, like milk left too long in the sun. The Wampanoag watched their ancestral places shrink, watched strangers plant flags upon fields that held their ancestors' bones. They watched livestock trample through crops that had once fed entire villages. They saw treaties treated as parchment to be torn the moment it ceased to benefit the colonists, and then displacement. It began with whispers, families urged to move just a little farther west for their own safety. Then came pressure, threats, violence woven into the fabric of daily life. Colonists seized resources with the confidence of men who believed the land itself had been waiting for them. The Wampanoag, once stewards of thriving coasts, now found themselves penned by boundaries not drawn by nature, but by foreign power. Their harmony with the land was disrupted by fences, farms, and muskets. In the span of a single lifetime, their world shrank from horizon to horizon, to whatever space colonists allowed them to occupy. What a dreadful alchemy it was. Compassion turned to exploitation, alliance turned to subjugation, and hope turned to ash. Listen carefully now. Do you hear it? The rustle of diseased leaves, the soft weeping of vanished villages, the echo of broken promises, the thinning breath of a people who extended mercy and received betrayal in return. These are not ghosts of fiction. These are the spirits of a story taught incorrectly for centuries, wrapped in cheerful myths and emptied of its heartbreak. But the truth, this truth, cannot be softened. It is carved into the land itself. It is whispered by rivers. It is held in the silence that falls over places where entire nations once lived. It lingers in the smoke of fires that tried to warm two civilizations, only to burn one of them. And as the shadows lengthened across the 17th century, the tension, the distrust, the slow tightening of colonial grip, all of it edged toward the wars and massacres yet to come. But that is the next chapter, the next descent, where violence will roar louder than any prayer. For now, remember this: before the pilgrims feasted, before they prayed, before they planted, the land itself was already scarred, and the hands that welcomed them, hands trembling with loss, would soon be forced to defend the very world they were trying to preserve. And now, we enter the storm. The fragile balance that once existed between the Wampanoag and the colonists, already fraying, already trembling beneath the weight of betrayal, finally snapped. The air thickened, the forests grew watchful, the rivers seemed to whisper warnings carried from village to village. Something ancient stirred beneath the soil, something carved from centuries of stewardship, something weary of witnessing desecration after desecration. For the colonists had not merely taken land, they had taken trust. They had not merely broken treaties, they had broken the very harmony that bound people to the earth. They had not merely expanded, they had swallowed, consumed, devoured. And the Wampanoag, once protectors of the shoreline, now found themselves pressed against the tightening jaws of colonial expansion. At the center of this gathering storm stood a man whom the English called King Philip, though his true name, Metacom, carried the weight and dignity of his lineage. He was the son of Massacre, the leader who had once welcomed the pilgrims with wary compassion. But compassion had been met with betrayal. Treaties had been met with trespass. And Metacom inherited not peace, but the burden of a broken legacy. He watched as his people's lands were carved into colonial maps. He listened as ministers preached that the earth belonged to the English by divine right. He saw his people tried in colonial courts for crimes invented to justify punishment. He witnessed the slow squeezing of Wampanoag sovereignty until breathing itself felt like rebellion. And then came the spark, a wrongful execution, a farce of a trial. 3 Wampanoag men, friends of Metacom, hanged by colonists in 1675. Their bodies swung beneath the indifferent sky, and the rope that held them also cinched the last ties that bound indigenous patience to colonial aggression. This was no longer a matter of land. It had become a matter of survival, of dignity, of refusing to be extinguished without a fight. The forest responded first. Branches crackled beneath hurried feet. Smoke spiraled into the horizon. Shadows moved with purpose. Metal glinted in torchlight. The Wampanoag would no longer kneel. They would no longer plead. They would no longer watch their children grow up strangers in their own homeland. War had come. But this was no ordinary war. It was a war fought in the dense labyrinth of New England's forests, beneath canopies that muffled sound and hid movement. It was a war fought in the swamps, where fog clung to the ankles of warriors, and every ripple in the water might be death approaching. It was a war of ambushes, of villages set ablaze, of farms left in ruins. And for the colonists, who had become accustomed to expansion without resistance, fear bloomed for the first time. Homes that once echoed with hymns now trembled beneath the roar of flames. Settlers looked over their shoulders as though the night itself had turned against them. The colonies, accustomed to pushing outward, now felt the pressure of an indigenous uprising closing in. For a brief moment, a brief, burning moment, Metacom's forces regained ground. Native nations united in fragile alliances: Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc. They struck back not out of cruelty, but out of desperation, out of the instinct to protect the last remnants of a vanishing world. But the colonists had something the native nations did not: endless reinforcements, endless weapons, endless supplies flowing across the Atlantic. And they wielded not only guns, but manipulation. They coerced tribes into turning against one another. They rewarded betrayal. They spread fear between nations that had once stood side by side. Divide and conquer, the oldest strategy, sharpened to perfection. And slowly the war turned. The colonists, now united across multiple towns and militias, pressed hard into indigenous homelands. They targeted food stores, burned fields, destroyed villages with merciless calculation. Winter became an enemy. Hunger gnawed at the bones of Metacom's people. Children shivered through nights where the cold was as deadly as any musket. Still, the resistance did not break. Still, the fire within the Wampanoag burned. Still, Metacom refused surrender. But the storm that had once seemed unstoppable now thinned into scattered embers. The Narragansett stronghold in the Great Swamp fell in a massacre as brutal as anything the land had witnessed before. Hundreds died. Winter winds carried their final cries across frozen marshes. Colonists declared yet another Thanksgiving Day after their victory, Thanksgiving again woven into the fabric of suffering. By 1676, the war was collapsing inward. Villages lay in ashes. Thousands were dead, native and colonial alike. Entire indigenous nations stood on the brink of erasure. The colonists, emboldened by the turning tide, intensified their brutality. Those captured were executed or enslaved, shipped across the ocean to the Caribbean, where they would live and die on plantations far from the lands their ancestors had tended for millennia. Families were ripped apart. Children vanished into foreign ports. The wind carried names that would never again be spoken on their ancestral soil. And in the forests where the war began, Metacom remained, hunted, grieving, unbroken, but fate, cruel and relentless, had already cast its lot. On a summer morning in August 1676, Metacom was cornered near Mount Hope. He fought until the end, refusing surrender, refusing the indignity of captivity. A colonial soldier, himself a native man coerced into serving the English, fired the shot that ended Metacom's life. The echo rippled across the land like a final heartbeat. His body was mutilated. His head was severed, displayed on a pike for 20 years in Plymouth Colony as a warning, as a trophy, as a macabre symbol of colonial triumph. And once again, a day of Thanksgiving was declared, a celebration, a feast, a prayer of gratitude for victory over the people who had once saved the colonists from starvation. But victory is a strange word, for though the colonists won the war, the land bore the scars of devastation. Entire tribes were scattered, shattered, or erased. Indigenous autonomy was broken. The balance of power had forever shifted. King Philip's War ended not with peace, but with silence, the kind of silence that lingers in the bones of a place long after the bodies have been buried. And that silence remains even now, if you listen carefully. In the rustle of leaves, in the hush of the rivers, in the shadows of the forests where Metacom once walked. For wars may end, but the land remembers. It always remembers. And so, we step away from the ashes of King Philip's War, though not far enough that the smoke has cleared. It lingers around us still, curling through the centuries like a restless ancestor, unwilling to allow peace to be built on unmarked graves. The path ahead seems brighter at first glance, illuminated by the warm glow of hearth fires and painted illustrations of pilgrims holding hands with native people. But you and I know better by now, don't we? That glow is not warmth. It is a lantern held up against truth to blind the onlookers. It is a curated light, a manufactured comfort. For episode 5 leads us into a quieter horror. Not massacre, not fire, not steel, but myth-making. A different kind of weapon. After the smoke of the 17th century cleared, the colonies grew. Cities rose. The relentless spread of settlement carved roads through what had once been sacred ground. The wars, though devastating, had conveniently created space for new farms, new fortunes, and new fantasies. And with each generation born farther from the memories of conflict, the harder edges of history softened. Or perhaps it is more honest to say, were smoothed. For a nation cannot be built on guilt, so it fashions nostalgia instead. And so, long before Thanksgiving became a national holiday, whispers began circulating through colonial households. Stories of a peaceful harvest meal, where pilgrims and native people sat together in mutual gratitude. These whispers did not yet form a legend, but they became the threads from which future weavers would spin a tapestry bright enough to cover the darkness beneath. That early gathering, whatever it was, however small, however unrecorded, became a seed from which imagination could sprout, convenient, soft, gentle. A single night of relative peace inflated into a symbol of unity, overshadowing the years of conflict before and after it. And as the generations moved on, the myth grew legs, then wings, then a halo. By the time the 1800s arrived, America hungered not for truth, but for identity. A fractured, expanding country needed traditions, stories of origin that could bind a sprawling nation together. And into this vacuum stepped the writers, the politicians, the myth-makers. One woman in particular, Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of a prominent magazine, became the architect of the Thanksgiving we know today. She championed the holiday with a devotion that bordered on religious. She published tales, romantic, sanitized tales, of pilgrim families gathered in harmony, of native people offering hospitality, of a country forged not in violence, but in fellowship. She petitioned presidents for decades, urging them to establish a national day of thanks. Hale did not invent Thanksgiving, no, but she invented the reason for it, or perhaps she reinvented it, crafting a version palatable for a nation tired of division. Her vision caught wind, drifting into parlors, schools, churches. Pain was edited out, pages of suffering torn from the book. The American public embraced this new narrative eagerly, as humans often embrace beautiful lies. Because lies, unlike truth, can be shaped as we please, smooth, warm, unthreatening. But it was during the Civil War, America's own internal cataclysm, that the myth was finally crowned. 1863. A year drowned in blood, the nation cracked open, brother fought brother. Fields meant for harvest became battlefields. Families buried sons without ceremony. The air tasted of iron and sorrow. Amid such ruin, President Abraham Lincoln sought a salve, something symbolic to remind the torn nation of unity, hope, divine guidance. And so, in the middle of the war, he declared a national day of thanksgiving, not to honor pilgrims, not to honor Native people, not to revisit history at all, but to craft a moment of shared identity in a time of chaos. Lincoln's proclamation spoke of gratitude, healing, prayer, noble words, necessary words. But beneath them lay a strange irony, a nation soaked in its own blood, reaching for a myth to bind it. From that moment forward, Thanksgiving belonged not to the past, but to the nation's imagination. A holiday born not from the harvest of 1621, nor from the alliances of fragile years, but from the depths of a civil war shaped into a tool of morale. And then gradually, the story took on its final, familiar form. Schoolbooks embellished it, paintings idealized it, statues immortalized it, Hollywood polished it. The pilgrims became noble. The native people became friendly, silent, grateful, almost childlike. The feast became peaceful, pure. Missing were the broken treaties. Missing were the villages turned to ash. Missing were the skulls left on pikes. Missing were the chains that dragged survivors into foreign lands. A myth cannot hold such things. A myth must be light enough for a child to carry. And so, the nation built its holiday upon a carefully constructed memory, smoothing every jagged edge of history and tucking away the bones. As the decades rolled on, families gathered around tables, joining hands, offering prayers of prosperity, often unaware that prosperity itself had been taken from others. The turkey replaced the truth. The harvest replaced the haunting. The story of unity replaced the reality of conquest. The modern Thanksgiving was less a commemoration and more an erasure, a kind of cultural amnesia dressed in warm colors and autumn leaves. And though millions would eventually come to question the tale, the myth had already become deeply set, woven into the fabric of the American identity like a patch covering a wound. And so we continue, deeper still into the marrow of this shadowed history, where each step forward feels like wading into colder waters, and each truth uncovered shivers with the weight of forgotten suffering. The uneasy peace between the colonists and the indigenous nations did not last, for peace made on wounds is peace destined to bleed. The land, already heavy with grief from the plague and betrayal, now began to tremble beneath the footsteps of soldiers. The muskets glinted with cold ambition, and the sound of marching boots echoed like distant thunder rolling toward an unsuspecting night. It is here, in this dark turning of the centuries, that the word Thanksgiving, a word so often painted with innocence, began to cloak something far more sinister. For in those early colonial years, days of Thanksgiving were not feasts of gratitude, but celebrations of victory. Victory bought with blood. The year was 1637, and the winds carried with them the scent of something disastrous. The Pequot people, keepers of their lands, traders, defenders of their kin, had come under the tightening grip of colonial fear, suspicion, and greed. Tensions escalated. Accusations were hurled like stones, and soon the colonists, joined by allied tribes who had been manipulated through promises and threats, surrounded a Pequot village near the Mystic River. It was dawn when the first flames licked the sides of the wooden palisades. The fire grew quickly, fed by dry bark, brush, and the screams rising from within. Women clutching infants, men attempting to break through the blockade, children stumbling through smoke. They found no mercy waiting outside. As the flames devoured the village, colonists waited with muskets ready. Those who escaped the fire were cut down. Those who remained inside were burned alive. In a matter of moments, a people were erased. The number of dead is still argued, but hundreds fell. Mothers, fathers, warriors, toddlers still learning to walk, and when the smoke cleared, when the cries ceased, when the river finally lay still, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared a day of thanksgiving. Yes, thanksgiving, a celebration, a proclamation of divine favor, a belief that this slaughter had been blessed by heaven, sanctioned by scripture, guided by righteous purpose. The colonists feasted, they prayed, they gave thanks for victory over the heathen. Do you hear the chilling twist of that? How the word thanks becomes an echo in a chamber filled with ghosts. How the meaning of gratitude becomes warped when spoken over the smoldering bones of a people who had never sought the colonists' wrath. It was not the only time. Through the decades that followed, whenever indigenous resistance arose, whenever a nation fought to protect its home, its children, its sacred places, and colonial forces crushed them, days of thanksgiving were declared. These celebrations were less about gratitude and more about power, about stamping triumph into the calendar as though conquest were a holy ritual. Imagine the silence that fell over the surviving tribes each time such proclamations spread. Imagine the bitter smoke rising from the ruins of their homes while colonists raised their voices in songs of praise. Imagine being told that your suffering was someone else's blessing. History remembers only the polished version. But beneath it, in the dust and bone of truth, lies a far darker reflection. Thanksgiving as a requiem for the conquered. The colonial mind was shaped by a belief in destiny, a belief that the land was theirs by divine right, that every river, every forest, every mountain had been waiting for their arrival. And with such conviction, even violence became sanctified. War became mission. Bloodshed became necessity. And celebration became a way to wash their hands clean in the eyes of their God. But the land did not forget. The rivers did not forget. And the people, those who survived, carried the memories like embers in their hearts. For the Pequots, the Mystic Massacre was not merely a moment of loss. It was an unraveling. Families torn apart. Survivors hunted, enslaved, scattered. Children taken from their tribes. The nation that had once thrived was forced into the shadows, reduced, broken, fragmented. Yet from that suffering, a truth grew. The holiday that would one day be romanticized as unity had in its early form been forged in violence. This is the part of the story rarely spoken aloud. This is the part whispered in hushed tones at the edges of historical texts, glossed over in classrooms, softened for young ears. But the shadows remember. The ground remembers. And in the telling of this tale, we are compelled to walk beside those memories, no matter how heavy they become. As the decades passed, the colonists continued to grow in number. Their towns flourished, fed by land they had seized and labor they had exploited. Their confidence swelled into arrogance. Their hunger for land became bottomless. and every time they triumphed over another indigenous nation, they proclaimed another day of thanksgiving. The word, once simple, once tied to harvests and the cycles of nature, became entangled with conquest. Gratitude became an echo of dominance. Celebration became a mask that hid violence behind hymns and feasts. But this cycle, this pattern of conquest and celebration, was not endless. It was building towards something even more devastating. The tension between the ever-expanding colonists and the indigenous nations, especially the Wampanoag, who had once saved the Pilgrims, was tightening like a rope pulled past its limit. A storm was coming, a war unlike any that had come before, a conflict that would stain the soil with more blood than the land had ever tasted. King Philip's War, the next chapter in this darkness. But before we step into that storm, linger a moment here, in the haunting aftermath of the mystic massacre, where the word thanksgiving hangs like a shroud over the dead. For to understand the wars that followed, to understand the centuries of mourning, you must understand that the holiday we celebrate today sprouted from roots soaked not only in gratitude, but in tragedy. These early Thanksgivings were not feasts of unity. They were proclamations of supremacy. They were hymns sung over graves. They were victory banners waving over broken nations. And though centuries have passed, the echoes remain, soft, distant, but unyielding. For history cannot be changed, only retold, only unmasked, only faced with trembling honesty. And now, the path leads onward, into the roar of rebellion, the fracture of alliances, and the war that would forever alter the fate of an entire people. And so, after centuries of myth-making, the story stands before us, polished, comforting, golden in appearance, yet hollow at its core. What was painted as a tale of harmony, of grateful pilgrims and generous native people, was in truth a tapestry woven from betrayal, violence, and erasure. Disease swept entire communities before the pilgrims even set foot on the shore. Lands were stolen, treaties broken, and villages burned. Generations of indigenous life were shattered, yet the celebratory narrative demanded silence, demanded gratitude, demanded forgetting. The holiday we now call Thanksgiving is built upon this deliberate amnesia. What was once cautious cooperation became colonization. What was survival became conquest, and what was mourning became myth. The feasts, the parades, the images of unity obscure the deeper truths. Massacres, displacement, and the enduring grief of peoples whose names were long erased from maps and memory. Yet beneath the veneer, the shadows persist. Descendants of the Wampanoag and other tribes gather still at Plymouth Rock, carrying memory like a torch, insisting that the world remember what history sought to conceal. They speak of ancestors lost, lands stolen, and cultures nearly destroyed, reminding us that myth cannot fully silence truth. So as we gather our tables, let us not forget the blood upon which the land was built, the lives displaced, or the voices silenced. Let remembrance accompany gratitude, and let mourning temper celebration. For only when we acknowledge the shadows beneath the feast can we truly understand the weight of this holiday and the history that continues to shape our present. The story of Thanksgiving is not just one of harvest and thanks. It is a story of survival, of memory, and of the enduring need to confront truths long buried.